Hey everyone, in today's video, I want to talk about the Social Security tax limit and answer the question, should it be increased or eliminated altogether? Now, before we get into this, let me assure you that my goal here is not to stir the pot. I know this is a topic that gets a lot of people on both sides of the issue really fired up. Typically, people that lean to the left believe that we should raise the cap or not even have a cap, and the folks on the right believe that the cap is just fine where it is, and raising taxes on higher income earners is not the solution to fixing the program. So today, I want to get into this and talk about not just what sounds good for sound bites in the media or what makes a certain income class feel protected. I want to peel all of that back and look at it based on what really matters, and that's the facts, and maybe even challenge your thinking, whichever side of the politics you find yourself on. But before we get too far into that, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe and hit that notifications bell too. There's going to be some really big changes coming to Social Security in the years ahead. And when they get close, I'll be breaking them down right here on this channel. And if you have those notifications turned on, you won't miss it. So before we start talking about the increase to the payroll taxes, let's take a quick moment and review how payroll taxes and the Social Security tax limit in general works. Then the proposed changes will make a lot more sense. So if you're an employee, pull out one of your pay stubs. You should see at least one line for FICA taxes. Now, the total FICA tax is 15.3%, but only 12.4% of that goes to fund Social Security, and the remaining 2.9% goes to Medicare. Now, some pay stubs may show this as a separate entry, so they'll show one for Social Security and one for Medicare, but just know it's the Social Security portion that we're talking about today. Now, the line on your pay stub for Social Security should represent 6.2% of your gross wages. Now, that's the amount you pay. In addition, your employer pays another 6.2% to bring the total up to 12.4%. Now, if you're self-employed, you're going to pay the entire 12.4%. But there is a limit on the wages that are subject to these taxes. In 2023, you only pay the Social Security portion of the FICA tax on the first $160,200. Earnings over that amount are not subject to this tax. And it's this concept that has some people upset. There are some folks out there who think it's not fair that some people have to pay tax on every dime they earn, but high-income earners stop paying these taxes once they pass the limit. When you couple this with a possibility of benefit cuts in 2034 because the Social Security Trust Fund is going to be drained, it seems like an easy fix. Just raise or eliminate the Social Security tax limit, and thus the system would gain the large influx of revenue needed to keep the system afloat. And over the years, there's been lots of legislative proposals to increase the tax limit. The only way these various proposals are different is in how much they would raise the cap. Some favor raising it a little bit. Some propose having a donut hole approach where the current cap would stay in place, but then the earnings after a certain amount would become subject to the Social Security tax. Some propose changing the limit every year based on the amount it needs to be to cover 90% of all wages. And then we have the proposal just to completely eliminate the cap and make all earnings subject to this tax. There really are too many proposals to cover in the short amount of time we have in today's video. So today, I only want to cover the proposals that have received the most attention. And for each of these, I'll tell you how much of the Social Security funding problem it will solve. And that part may surprise you. Before we get into the details of any of these options, we need to take a quick look at the history of the Social Security portion of payroll taxes. Without this framing, it's easy to believe some of the misinformation that's being thrown around. When the Social Security Act first became law, it created a brand new mandatory payroll tax and a whole lot of lawsuits. A lot of people didn't support the Social Security Act because they saw the parallels between a big social insurance program and socialism as just being too close. And they believed that a country built on capitalism shouldn't engage in what they thought were welfare policies. Now, these lawsuits eventually made their way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled that the Social Security Act was constitutional. The court determined that the government did, in fact, have the power to levy a new tax for a social insurance program. Now, I'm not sure what those people that filed the lawsuits would say now if they could see how the system has grown. Probably something like, I told you this would happen. In 1940, the Social Security program cost $62 million. Now, that's a lot of money, but by 2022, it had exploded into a program that cost just over $1.2 trillion What started out as a program that took 0.29% of the federal budget, and that was in 1940, has now grown to be 20% of all federal spending. So this is a program that's been expanded well beyond the original Social Security Act. And with those expansions, the increased need for revenue to fund it has also been there. In the original version of President Roosevelt's Social Security Act, there was actually no mention of a Social Security tax limit. The assumption was that everyone who fell under the coverage net would pay the payroll tax on all of their earnings. But there were a lot of people who didn't fall under the coverage net. Roosevelt's version of the bill was solely focused on creating a floor of protection against poverty, and that meant that this new program wouldn't have anything to do with higher income earners. Thus, in the original act, all non-manual workers who earned more than $250 per month were specifically excluded from participation. But as the Social Security Act worked its way through the legislative process, the member of the House Ways and Means Committee could see that the program was going to need that tax revenue from the high-income earners, and their version of the bill dropped the exemption for the high-income earners. But in a concession to the original act from Roosevelt, they then put a Social Security tax limit in place of $3,000 per year, which was the annual equivalent to Roosevelt's monthly amount. And they set the Social Security total payroll tax at 2%. Now, just a year later, the federal government published a pamphlet to help convince Americans to get on board with a new program that laid out the future of Social Security taxes. This pamphlet showed that the employee part of the new payroll tax would start at 1% and incrementally increase through 1949, at which point they promised that 3% would be the most you would ever pay. Well, once the Social Security Act was passed, that schedule was thrown out through a series of amendments over the years, and once the tax rate started moving up, it blew right through the 3% that the federal government had promised would be the maximum. But it wasn't just the tax rate that was increasing. The limit on earnings that the tax was applied to was increasing as well. Through the years, the maximum limit was increased by congressional action only, and that's up until the Social Security amendments of 1977, which began indexing the maximum wage base to changes in the average wage index, which is still how it's done today. That's why you can see an increase nearly every year in the amount of wages subject to the Social Security tax. Indexing to wages was meant to permanently fix the system so they wouldn't have to keep tinkering with it on an ongoing basis. When they were drafting the 1977 amendments, they increased the wage base up to a point where 90% of all earnings paid would be subject to Social Security taxes. This was the ratio they believed would create a sustainable revenue stream to keep the system healthy. Now, since then, we've seen something interesting happen. Over the past few decades, the percentage of earnings covered by the tax has slipped below the 90% threshold. And according to the last report, which was 2021, now only 81.4% of earnings are subject to Social Security taxes. So this is well away from the 90% threshold number. The interesting part about this is why that number has decreased. Let's look at this data another way. The green line is the percentage of earnings that are not subject to Social Security taxes because they are above the Social Security tax limit. You can see that that started around the 10% mark in 1980, which is the inverse of that 90% of earnings that are under the limit. Right in line with the 1977 amendments and the way they were intended. But as time went on, there were more and more earnings that were above the maximum, and now nearly 20% of earnings aren't subject to Social Security taxes because they're over the limit. But the percentage of workers with earnings above the limit has actually stayed consistent at about 6%. This can only mean one thing. The earnings of that 6% have grown faster than the earnings of the average wage index or the average worker. In the eyes of those who want to raise the Social Security tax limit, none of this is fair and needs to be corrected. Their view is that there's a limited amount of earnings and 90% of those should be taxable. But those who are opposed to raising the limit say the fact that there are still only 6% of workers who are over the limit is proof that the Social Security tax limit is working as intended in the 1977 amendments, and higher income earners shouldn't be punished because their earnings grew faster. But according to several polls, there is a lot of public support for raising the Social Security tax limit, and the politicians who want to see this change have made numerous suggestions for how this should be accomplished. But I do want to stay concise in this video, so I won't cover every possible scenario, just those that we have the measurement data on to forecast the effect of making this change. But before we can have a good conversation about these changes, we really have to address the part that no one wants to talk about. What do you do with the extra earnings that now fall under the increased limit? It's easy to say scrap the cap and make the rich pay their fair share when you're looking for votes, but thus far, I haven't heard any of these politicians get specific about what happens to the additional earnings. Now, right now, if you make over the cap, you don't pay Social Security taxes on those earnings, but you don't get credit towards your future Social Security benefit either. So if the cap gets increased, do you credit those additional taxes paid in towards a future benefit? If so, this could create some really large Social Security checks in the future. I can't really imagine that seeing high-income folks receive Social Security checks that were $10,000 per month or more would sit well with some, but there's always been a connection between the taxes you pay in versus the benefits you receive. And once that connection is broken, Social Security would look and act just really like another welfare program. So before a change can be made, there are really two decisions that have to be made. First, how much do you increase the maximum wage base? And second, what do you do with the earnings that come in as a result of increasing the maximum wage? To fully understand these, though, you really have to briefly understand the very high-level basics of the Social Security calculation. Now, I know there are a lot of you who watch all of my videos, and you may be getting tired of the repetition, but I want to make the assumption in each of these videos that this is the first time you've ever watched any of my videos, and so I do lay out the necessary groundwork to ensure our conversation makes sense. To calculate benefits, the Social Security Administration will index all your prior earnings to account for inflation. Now, they only use earnings up to the applicable maximum for that particular year. So, for example, in 1990, the taxable maximum earnings amount was $51,300. So if you made $70,000 in that year, only the $51,300 would be indexed for inflation and counted for your benefit calculation. Once they've indexed your earnings, they take out the highest 35 years and calculate the monthly average from those 35 years. Then you just apply that monthly average to a formula that's commonly called the bend point formula. Now, there's two numbers that make up this formula, but they're really separated into the three bands. So you have earnings that are up to the first bend point, and for those, you multiply by 90%, and that's the first part of your benefit. For earnings that fall between the first and second bend point, you multiply by 32%, and that's the second part of your benefit. And then for earnings that are greater than the second bend point, you multiply by 15%, and that's the third part of your benefit. You simply add those three parts together and arrive at your PIA or your benefit amount at full retirement age. So understanding how the formula works, the question is, what do you do if you increase the maximum earnings subject to payroll taxes? How do you credit those additional taxes to future benefit? Do you continue using the same formula and credit all of the additional earnings from the new maximum limit to this top multiplier of 15%? Or do you add another band to the formula that's simply all the earnings beyond the current law maximum tax limit and credit those at a lower multiplier of, say, 3%? And of course, there's always the option of not crediting the additional earnings at all. Now, down in the description, I'm going to link up a congressional research report that goes into more detail about changing the tax limit. And in this report, they list several options and give the results each would have on the longevity of the system as measured by the long-term horizon, which is 75 years. Now, all of these options assume that nothing else changes with the system. Benefits aren't increased, they're not decreased, or there's no other fundamental changes. And I won't go over all the various changes, but I do want to cover the two that I think are most likely based on some of the noise we've been hearing recently. And then you can go on and read the others for yourself. First, we have the elimination of the Social Security tax limit. This is the most severe option. This would be where all earnings are subject to the 12.4% payroll tax, and they continue using the current formula where all earnings over the second bend point are credited at 15%. This would fix 57% of the 75-year shortfall. Now, if they add a new band to the formula where benefits above the current max were credited at 3%, this would fix 66% of the long-term shortfall. And if they eliminate the wage base and not offer any credit towards the benefit, this would fix 73% of the shortfall. So those are the options for eliminating the wage base, both with and without a formula change. But then we have the one that I think is more likely to have bipartisan support in a comprehensive Social Security reform package, and that's increasing the Social Security limit up to the point where 90% of all wages are covered and subject to the Social Security portion of payroll taxes. Now, today, if they were to do that, that would mean that the Social Security tax limit would increase to about $340,000. Now, the only way they have presented this in the Congressional Research Report is through a phase-in approach, which is likely the way it would be put in place anyway. The report has a phase-in over 10 years where the limit is increased every year until it gets to the point where 90% of earnings are covered for the tax. And then on an annual basis, the calculation would determine where the tax limit needs to be to stay at the 90% benchmark. If they use this method, but leave the current cap in place for purposes of calculating a benefit, meaning there would be no credit given to benefits for the additional taxes, this would solve 30% of the long-term shortfall. If they leave the formula in place and all additional earnings would credit the top band at 15%, this would solve 22% of the shortfall. And if they were to credit AIM above the current top band with a new band at 2.5%, this would solve 29% of the shortfall. Now, I think this option, along with an increase of the full retirement age and a few other changes, will likely be a component of the changes that we see coming out in the years ahead. The political winds are just blowing too hard. And I think these options, along with an increase to the full retirement age and a few other changes, will likely be a component of those changes we see. But next time you hear someone saying that if everyone would pay their fair share, we wouldn't have a problem with Social Security, tell them that you know better, because now you see that a payroll tax increase on its own will not fix the problem. And here's where I'd like to hear from you. After watching this, what do you think? Do you think the maximum tax should be left alone, raised, or just altogether eliminated? Please let me know down in the comments below. I enjoy reading all of those. Also, remember, this is your retirement. Continue to learn and stay informed. I've created a number of resources to help you do that. And for starters, there's my retirement planning cheat sheet and my Social Security cheat sheet. Both of these are completely free and are packed with information that I've distilled from thousands of government website pages. You can also watch my online workshop. I'll put a link to those and the cheat sheets down below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel. As this sorts of stuff develops with Social Security, I'll be creating content around it to keep you informed. And again, if you're subscribed with notifications turned on, you'll know as soon as I release a new video. Thank you so much for watching.